Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Tax Equality for Immigrants and Child Poverty. The Center for Migration Studies and its co-sponsors, the Price Center for Social Innovation at the University of Southern California, and Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice are pleased to present the discussion of the report, Tax Equality for Immigrants, the indispensable ingredient for remedying child poverty in the United States. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to the moderator of this panel, CMS's Executive Director, Donald Kerwin.
Well, thank you, Emma, and thanks to all of you who joined us today. We're very pleased to have you with us, including those of you who have worked on this issue of tax inequality for many years. I wanted to start by thanking our event co-sponsors. They are the Price Center for Social Innovation at the University of Southern California and Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice. Before I introduce the report authors, Roberto and Hannah Finling, and also Laura Peralta Schulte, who's going to be our respondent, I wanted to introduce and say how very pleased we are to have the Office of Partnership and Engagement, or OPE, with us today. It turns out that Ava Malona cannot join us, but we're happy to have Jason Mayer with us, who's the active Chief of Staff for DHS's Office of Partnership and Engagement. Jason is going to speak to us about OPE's work, but I hope he will speak about other things as well. And of course, we know that the Biden administration has prioritized immigrant inclusion, integration, the reduction of child poverty, and of course, the importance of partnerships overall to address all of those important issues. So thanks very much to Jason Mayer for joining us. And Jason, you're up.
Don, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay?
We can, yep.
Fantastic. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting us to join you on this auspicious occasion. My name is Jason Mayer. I'm OPE's acting Chief of Staff. I cannot at all fill Ms. Malona's shoes, but I'll do my very best to pass along some information and share with you kind of our vision and our priorities and our activities within DHS. As you all know, the Biden-Harris administration's Build Back Better agenda focuses on creating jobs, cutting taxes, and lowering costs for working families, all paid for by making the tax code fairer and making the wealthiest and large corporations pay their fair share. We believe, the administration and DHS believes, we must extend the American Rescue Plan's expended tax credits. They've lifted millions out of poverty and made it much easier for families to afford childcare. Tax equality, improving our immigration system, and addressing child poverty are key economic drivers of the Build Back Better agenda. Put simply, new Americans and their children fuel our economy. They run small businesses, create millions of jobs, serve as essential workers who, by the way, have been critical in getting us through the COVID-19 pandemic. Others are on the front lines of critical biomedical research while working to cure current and emerging diseases. To us and millions of Americans like us, immigrants and refugees are part of the solution to what makes America exceptional and not a safety or security risk to be managed. Welcoming and supporting immigrants revives and strengthens our communities in ways that benefit the entire country. I am pleased, and Ava is pleased, to support the advancement of immigration and the DHS mission. Ava and I both joined DHS because we believed in the Secretary, and we believed in this President's vision for the future. Before we talk about broader DHS efforts, I'd like to take a moment and talk about the office that Ava leads, the Office of Partnership and Engagement. We coordinate DHS's engagement with critical stakeholders across the board nationwide, and even in some cases internationally, including state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, elected officials, law enforcement, the private sector, colleges and universities, faith-based organizations, and civil society. We advocate for and represent the interests of these stakeholders through the department's policymaking process, and we advise the Secretary and the Deputy Secretary on stakeholder engagement matters across the board. We have several sub-offices within OPE that I sort of alluded to a minute ago. So one is the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, which promotes an integrated national approach to Homeland Security. We coordinate with state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. And I do want to foot stomp that last piece there. We work quite a bit with tribal governments, which is a priority of this administration that perhaps wasn't so much for the administration previously. Private sector, we provide Secretary with advice on issues relevant to businesses. We bring businesses into the fold as it relates to aviation security, trade and travel. Certainly now on Operation Allies Welcome, bringing our Afghan partners and friends home from Afghanistan and resettling them in the United States. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. The Office of Academic Engagement maintains relationships with members of the academic community. We engage with school administrators, faculty, and students on a range of issues that focus on both faith-based and civil society organizations. And for these students, particularly ones that are coming back amidst the pandemic, we've spent quite a bit of time over the summer working on safety and security protocols for universities. We also operate 2 national public awareness campaigns. One is called See Something, Say Something. You've probably seen that. And the other is called the Blue Campaign, which is dedicated to combating human trafficking in all of its forms. Finally, we have what we call the Social Impact Office, which we advise the Secretary on developing strategic plans, special initiatives, and policies related to social impact and volunteerism. We represent the Secretary, DHS, and OPE leadership with public and private nonprofit organizations. The Biden administration and Secretary Mayorkas and his team are making positive and lasting changes to immigration. Since the 20th of January, the Biden strategy has been focused on the basic premise that our country is safer, stronger, and more prosperous with a fair, safe, and orderly immigration system that welcomes immigrants, keeps families together, and allows people, allows people, both newly arrived immigrants and people who have lived here for generations, to more fully contribute to our country. On the very day he was sworn in, President Biden took steps to preserve and fortify DACA, and we're very proud of that. On the 20th, he ended the discriminatory bans on entry to the United States. And the creation of the task force to reunite families, of course, you're well aware of that. Families that remain separated because of actions taken by the last administration. We believe that families belong together. This task force works across the U.S. government with key stakeholders and representatives of impacted families and with partners across the hemisphere. Let me stop there, if you don't mind, Don, and I'll either take any questions or sort of allow you to continue on from there. Over.
Thank you, Jason. I think we're going to take questions at the end. So just to thank you for joining us today, and thanks to OPE, and say hello to Ava for us. We really appreciate your participation in this event.
I sure will. Thank you so much for your time, and nice to meet everyone. Take care.
Okay. So let me just make a few prefatory comments. We know that child poverty is rampant in the United States, one of the richest country in the world, and it's still a huge problem. And we have a particular problem related to the impoverishment of children of undocumented immigrants. And the great majority of these children, of course, are US citizens. Our immigration, public benefit, and tax policies bear a lot of the blame for that problem. Immigrants pay taxes, but don't fully benefit from the taxes they pay, nor do their family members. These are longstanding problems. So the question is, is there real cause for hope that these inequities will finally be meaningfully addressed? There is some hope. President Biden has promised to cut child poverty in half. We can think about the heroic work of immigrant and other essential workers in response to our ongoing public health crisis that's now widely recognized and fresh on everybody's minds. And we see promising state action on tax inequality, minimum wage, and other issues. And of course, there's a large community of advocates working on these issues in various contexts, including the budget reconciliation. So whenever there's a crisis, the theme always seems to be some version of building back better. But in this case, that theme, in response to multiple crises, seems to have some real legs. And of course, it has very strong merits too. That's really what this paper is about. And it's one of the best, most timely, consequential papers that we've had the privilege to publish in our Journal on Migration and Human Security. We're going to start with a short presentation, 10 minutes or so, by the authors, Roberto Suro and Hannah Finling. We'll follow that with a response and comments by Laura Peralta Schulte. And after that, we'll have time for questions and answers. Please send them to the Q&A function and responses by our speakers, and hopefully a conversation. The speakers' bios are on our website, but let me just briefly introduce them. Roberto Suro is a professor in the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism and the Saul Price School of Public Policy at the University of Southern California. He's also Associate Director of the Price Center for Social Innovation. Prior to joining the USC faculty in August of 2007, he was the director of the Pew Hispanic Center. And prior to that, he had a long and distinguished career as a journalist, which I don't think he's ever really given up. So he's just an extraordinarily accomplished man. He's the author of several books, numerous book chapters, research reports, and other publications. And we've been privileged to work and collaborate with Roberto on publications involving immigration federalism and a long report on the implementation of the DACA program. Hannah Finling, who co-authored the paper, is a project specialist in the Office of the President at USC, specializing in sustainability. She completed her Master's of Public Administration at USC's Price School of Public Policy just this year. As a graduate assistant, Hannah has researched and written on immigration policy and trends. She's also worked for 5 years as an immigration paralegal, primarily handling family-based immigration cases, and she's volunteered as an aide to asylum seekers on the US-Mexico border. Laura Peralti Schulte, our respondent today, is chief lobbyist for Network, the lobby for Catholic social justice, where her job is to develop and execute strategies to advance Network's agenda on Capitol Hill and with the administration. So she's really perfectly situated and been very active on these issues and can speak on what's happening on Capitol Hill and with the administration on tax equality. She's an experienced lobbyist, a lawyer, and perhaps her best credential is she was a high school government and history teacher for 9 years. So let me stop there and turn it over to Roberto and Hannah and just thank them and compliment them for bringing forward this paper.
Thank you, Don, for that introduction, and thank you especially for the many years of collaboration and guidance and friendship that we've had together and working with everybody there at the center. Hannah and I are going to give you a sort of a quick top line review of the report, then we'll go on to comments and questions and answers. So we could start, we have a brief PowerPoint with a few slides here. If we could start with that. This report has got such a long title because there are two pieces to it. The first is the tax equality piece. The federal tax code is supposed to be blind to immigration status. And tax equality is about ensuring that everyone, regardless of status, who pays into the system has the same access to tax credits coming out. The other main theme here is about child poverty, as Don was saying, and ensuring that equal access to credits is as powerful a poverty fighting tool as it can be. We believe that advancing an advocacy agenda down these two avenues could open a new chapter in the immigration policy debate. And we believe that agenda is now gaining momentum in many state capitals and in Washington, most prominently now with the Build Back Better agenda, which we just heard about, and the reconciliation bill. Yeah, next slide. So as a major element of the reconciliation plan and of President Biden's overall proposals to improve the lot of American families is an assault on child poverty through the expansion of two tax credit programs. The EITC is the largest needs-tested cash benefit anti-poverty program in the country, about 26 million plus taxpayers in 2019. It phases out at about $50,000 of income, and the 97% of the taxpayers who receive it are in families with children. CTC is a much broader program. 90% of taxpayers take advantage of it. 60% of the dollar amounts are for households with incomes above $50,000. The Build Back Better agenda, the reconciliation plan, has a very important provisions in terms of expanding how the child tax credit would benefit poor families in particular. Many years of evidence now show that the EITC and the CTC are highly effective at poverty reduction, and they draw bipartisan support because they both deliver immediate relief and also incentivize employment. But there's a problem here. Next slide. Nationwide, roughly 10 million children live in poverty. That's the target of all these programs. But about 2 million of those children, about 1 out of 5, are denied full access to tax credits because of their parents' immigration status. And among those left behind, 85%, about 1.6 million kids, are US citizens. That's a problem. And tax inequality is at fault. Next slide, please. So strictly speaking, by the letter of the law, the tax code is supposed to be blind to immigration status. There's a complicated formula called the substantial presence test, which determines whether or not you count as a resident for tax purposes. And again, explicitly, it doesn't matter what your status is. If you're here for more than a few months a year, the immigration authorities might want to deport you, but the tax authorities want to tax you. Presence is what matters here. And presence, it's worth remembering, counts in other ways too. The guarantees of constitutional rights are based on presence, not status. Let me now turn it over to Hannah to do some more of the details here. Thank you. Next slide.
Thanks, Roberto. So the mechanism for inequality is a two-tier system of tax identification. We're all familiar with Social Security numbers. The individual taxpayer identification number, known as the ITIN, is also 9 digits, looks the same to the untrained eye, and performs many of the same functions. An ITIN can be used not only to pay taxes, but also to open a bank account, to take out a mortgage, trade stocks, and much more. But ITIN holders and their children are fully excluded from the EITC, from the federal EITC, and they're excluded from the CTC unless the kids have a social. Exclusion from the EITC means that ITIN filers working for poverty wages have a higher tax burden, meaning they're made poorer than similarly situated filers who have Social Security numbers. And exclusion is only one of the problems. Next slide. After the number of ITIN applications increased rapidly, with the encouragement of federal authorities who wanted to bring all non-citizens into the banking and tax systems, ITIN use fell off rapidly after 2015. Why? Next slide. A combination of rule changes, statutory initiatives, and budget shortfalls have rendered getting and keeping an ITIN more and more difficult for would-be taxpayers. Consider that most applicants have to submit original documents like their passports, marriage, and birth certificates by mail to the IRS and may not get them back for months. Next slide. But nevertheless, there is good news. Though initially excluded, ITIN filers got some access to the second and third stimulus payments. And since July 2020, 7 states have extended their EITCs, their state EITC credits to ITIN filers, and 4 others have legislation pending to do the same. The pandemic's toll on poor families and the essential worker narrative provided an impetus that has echoed all the way to Washington. And back to Roberto to wrap up. Next slide.
So we propose a broad agenda here that starts with inclusion, but goes on to remedying the problems at the IRS, and then a national campaign to encourage ITIN use, to educate people in how to apply for an ITIN, how to use it, how to get taxpayer tax credits. We believe this represents a new way of thinking about immigration rights, immigration policy, a new frame, one in which the ITIN eligible present themselves and are recognized as workers and as parents. They fulfill their tax obligations and have equal access to poverty fighting tax credits in return. Thank you. Next slide. It's important to remember that we need to go beyond simply changing the eligibility standards, some of which is already, and changing those standards is already under debate in the reconciliation bill. For example, in the child tax credit, we can talk about that later. But that's a necessary first step. Reforming the procedures and public education and registration are necessary follow-ons. Next slide. Equal access to tax credit does more than simply remedy a flaw in existing policies. It does more than reduce poverty. It could open a new chapter in the way we talk about immigration policy. Inclusion values ITIN filers as workers and parents. ITIN participation would be an on-ramp to compliance for those outside the law in other regards. And the ITIN agenda embeds a form of legal recognition in vital tax and social policies, and in the functioning of important bureaucracies in Washington and the states. Thank you. Looking forward to your comments and questions.
Laura, why don't we go to you at this point, and kind of what are you working on? What are you seeing? What are you hearing on the Hill on these issues? And if you'd like to, please do talk substantively on them too.
That sounds wonderful. So happy to be a part of this conversation. It is so near and dear to all of our hearts. I thought today I would try to approach this by using what I like to call the 3P analysis: policy, process, and politics, because it's all in play right now, particularly as it relates to the child tax credit. In terms of the policy, we are working together with, and really led by, the immigrant community on trying to expand not only tax credits, but other benefits to immigrants. You know, from our perspective, and really based from, at least at Network and at CMS, from a faith lens, you know, we believe that we work because we believe everybody has human dignity and should have the opportunity to thrive. So this is mission, and there are very active groups trying to make sure that the credits are accessible, that healthcare is accessible, that SNAP is accessible. This is the time. In the Build Back Better discussion, Roberto and Hannah, I'm so glad you really framed this in very much the way that we're framing it on the Hill, you know, particularly as it relates to the child tax credit. We know that if 1 in 5 kids is excluded from a major resource that parents have, we have evidence that parents are using for food, for rent, for just daily living, we have got to do our best to make sure that that kids have access. So right now, we on the Hill have been working particularly with the tax communities, the Senate Finance Committee, and with House Ways and Means to insist that that they roll back Trump-era exclusions of immigrant children for the child tax credit. You know, we think that at this moment, our leaders have to lean into the opportunity to make the expansions to the credit permanent, accessible, inclusive, and fair. And again, from a policy standpoint, for us, this is about children thriving, their families thriving, not a matter of race, ethnicity, immigration status, or zip code. So in terms of where we're at There is good news to report as it relates to the child tax credit. You know, we know that in terms of the Ways and Means Committee, they're just finishing up their first draft. And again, led by immigrant right groups, we got restoration of the child tax credit for kids with ITINs. The challenge that I want to make sure everybody is aware of is keeping it in there. We don't want this to be a process where we get it in one bill, but don't get it through the Senate and don't get it through over to the president to sign. In terms of process, I'll just give you very bright lines as to how we are moving forward. Today, all of the committee staffs in the House are required to get the various drafts of their pieces and parts of budget reconciliation to Speaker Pelosi. Over the next couple of days, there is going to be an intense, an emphasis on the word intense, discussion at leadership levels as to what actually makes it into a bill that will go to the floor. So the faith community, the immigration community are making sure that this ITIN rollback of Trump's policies stays in through the House process and goes forward. At the same time, again, from a process standpoint, that we know that the conversations between the House and the Senate are at a fever's pitch. So what does that mean? That means that we are working right now trying to identify, meet with, pressure, advocate, educate members of the Senate why it is important to mend this gap. So the House is scheduled or likely to take up their budget reconciliation bill next week is what leadership is telling us. We know that the Senate will not be marking up. This is going to be a kind of an internal committee and caucus decision. Remember, this is a Dem-only bill. We would expect the Senate to then take up their bill, and then the bill will then go back to the House for a vote. I think right now the most important thing to do is focus on the politics of this. And really, politics is all about math. Let's just be real with what it is. It is getting 218 votes in the House and under reconciliation, getting 50 votes or a complete Democratic consensus. There is no room for error. And we know right now there are extremely powerful interests on the Hill and off the Hill to kill this bill. And in particular, we know that since it is a Dem-only bill, if the Senate votorama exercise is, which happened as the budget reconciliation process was going forward, if that is any indication of what's going to happen once again, when the Senate takes up the final Build Back Better bill, we know immigration specifically is going to be a wedge issue that they try to drive Democrats apart on. So who do we have to focus on? Not surprisingly, both in the House and in the Senate, the key threshold is going to be, can we keep moderates? Can we keep moderates in the game on this issue? There is very, very intense work going on in West Virginia, in Arizona, in some of the places where we are trying to firm up Democratic members to support an inclusive CTC. So that is ongoing now. I think our communities will be make or break on whether or not we achieve this goal. The time is now, because as we know, this is bold legislation that is a once in a generation opportunity. That is the goal. If I could just maybe close by talking about something that is not legislative, but good news. It matters who we elect. Good news out of the Biden administration, because I wanted to say they have been spot on one of the issues that Roberto and Hannah has raised, and that is all about implementation. So having worked very hard on the American Rescue Plan, seeing the census data out yesterday that showed how effective these tools are, they are laser focused on implementation, and particularly trying to reach hard to reach populations that maybe don't file taxes or just are unfamiliar with the system. So I am confident Gene Sperling over there is in charge of it for the White House. They have been doing a terrific job trying to listen to folks. So I'm going to leave my comments with a sense of hope. You know, we have the capability to get this passed. We have a ton of work to do because we know how immigration plays, and we've got to get particularly Catholic members like Mr. Manchin and Mr. Tester to be comfortable with an inclusive credit. We also have an administration that, as Jason talked about earlier, is committed to justice and poverty reduction. So I'll leave it there, Don. I'm going to be a person. Pope Francis says we are called to be people of hope. So I will stop right there and happy to take any questions.
Let me just ask kind of a general question, because it sounds like the moment now is really a political moment, that we're in this kind of intense technical process about what measures go forward, and the negotiations are happening and lobbying is going full bore. But I actually wanted to ask something different, which is, what arguments got us to this point? You know, what's working on Capitol Hill? I mean, Laura, you spoke about kind of the human dignity, human flourishing. You know, those are arguments I love to make too, but you know, they're not often compelling kind of in a political setting, or they don't resonate just with certain members at the very least. And as I was reading the paper, it seemed like there was a lot of equity type of arguments being made. You know, you're a member of the country for the purposes of paying taxes, for example, but you know, not in a lot of other ways. Or these crises, they exacerbate inequalities, and tax policy is one way to address that, you know, as an equitable matter. Or you have this situation that Hannah's talking about of separate and unequal treatment of tax filers. Or, you know, you're a person for tax purposes, but you're basically not a person in our society for a lot of other purposes. So I'm curious as to kind of which of those resonates, or are there others? Are there other things that people are thinking about entirely, particularly the policymakers here?
So I'll maybe start and Roberto and Hannah definitely feel free to jump in. You know, I think that there are two huge factors that are creating the ripeness of the situation. One is what was mentioned in the report. You know, COVID has really, and the impacts of COVID have really opened eyes. And this is, I always say we meet with more Republicans sometimes than Democrats. It's really both sides of the aisle. You know, it has opened eyes about the significant inequality in our society, and which leads to death. When you look at death rates, when you look at unemployment rates, there is a huge racial justice component to this. And I think that in my meetings with folks, people are very sensitive to that, and sensitive to what Hannah is saying, which is our immigrant sisters and brothers are like key to our thriving as a community. So I think that there's a general recognition on that, which is really important. The second piece is, and Roberto, you can speak to this so clearly, like the immigrant groups are organized. And a lot of this, I have to say, is frankly, you know, the best organizing in a lot of respects comes out of the Trump experience, because pre-Trump, we were all kind of scattered. The faith groups are here and this group is here, and never anybody sits at the same table. It was so heinous what the previous administration's policies were, that it drove cooperation like I have never seen in the immigration space. So the growth of the movement, I'm a big believer in organizing. The growth of the movement, coupled with just the reality of COVID, I think has been a real sea change on this. We were working with colleagues in very much Republicans and Democrats to try to, in the Trump administration, get cash payments for immigrant kids. And we finally got at least folks with US citizenship under the Trump administration. We prioritized the work on the ITINs in this administration and continue to do that. So, from the idea that we really are one community, the idea about racial equity, these are all the idea of reducing child poverty, and differentiating between kids and their parents. These are all issues that are, I think, resonating with folks, but we have to contend with the biggest factor, which is fear. And there is some deep fear in Democrats, particularly in certain states, that this becomes a political issue for them. So our job is to equip them with the messages they need to stay faithful.
Roberto or Hannah, do you want to respond to that or speak to that in some way?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that Laura said is true. One thing I noticed looking at the state campaigns individually was how different they all were. Some of them really focused on the racial equity or immigrant rights aspect of the issue, while others actually tried to avoid it completely. And this was just one element in a much larger tax bill. Don't say anything about immigrants. We don't need to talk about immigration, just fixing an error in the tax code. So I think it was really interesting seeing, depending on the context, how advocates chose to frame this issue to be most successful.
I would underscore just a couple of points. I mean, one is the matter of Trump. One thing that Democrats pretty universally have agreed, and that the president announced as an absolute priority, was to reverse the worst of what Trump had done on immigration matters. What's on the table now in reconciliation, adding back children who don't have a social to the child tax credit, is merely reversing a Trump measure. It is not moving the ball. It is not giving anybody any benefit that they didn't get before Trump came in and took it away. It is one of those measures that could have been a first day measure under the Biden criteria, where he announced, like, here's a whole raft of things that Trump did that we're reversing. So that's all that's on the table. There's no expansion of access to tax credits to anybody who is a non-citizen under the legislation currently under consideration in Washington. In the states, by contrast, and this is often the case, the states on immigrant rights lead Washington. They have been doing it consistently now for a number of years as Washington remains stalemated. We've seen big states with big populations of immigrants saying that it's a matter of social policy. And as Hannah was pointing out, many different, the articulation has varied a great deal. But it substantially returns to the question of poverty, and particularly child poverty, when you, with the EITC, even more than the child tax credit. And the expansion of the EITC at the state level allows states to get at some of the most stubborn and difficult problems of child poverty, populations that have been difficult to reach otherwise. And it incentivizes work. It is proven to be successful. And that is an imperative in important places. And I would add, given that what states are doing, one of the great forms of assistance that Washington could lend beyond access is by executive action. This administration could order the IRS to make the entire process of acquiring and keeping an ITIN much simpler. It could devote resources to it so that in a place like California or Colorado or any of the other states, an immigrant family now, there are real benefits, it's a substantial money that is available through state EITCs and state CTCs to people who are ITIN filers. Washington can make it easier for people to get those funds without getting to the even broader agenda of dealing with the limitations to eligibility.
Thank you. Let's go to some questions from the audience now. I think I'll ask 3 of the questions, and whoever would like to respond, please respond. And the first is, why is it that there exist these gray zones where people's physical presence is allowed in a country, but they're not allowed access to their full human dignity? How can immigrants help to advocate for these reforms? What would you suggest for good alliances or approaches? Actually, why don't we stop there? Because the other 2 questions are a bit different. Joint network.
A lot of the states had, coalitions, big coalitions of diverse organizations that worked together for years for these policy changes. So I would definitely, look, depending on where you live, see what's in your area, because there are these coalitions across the country working on the state level to make this happen. And I'm sure there's room for involvement there.
Yeah, I think the same is true in the federal space. There are, I think this one configuration of our table on immigration is like 400 organizations. Again, a product of desperation during the last administration. But join network if you want to as well, or I can definitely put give suggestions of other groups that are doing great work. And Roberto, I think you're absolutely right. I just want to I was glad that you mentioned it, that this is a tiny step just to restore what we lost under the 2017 bill. But if we can get this victory under our belt, we can move forward with full inclusion.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, this is a question about a person that's in a state whose political leadership is not favorable to these issues. So if a person is in another state other than the state of a moderate Democrat, can they do something to inspire them to work for this tax credit? How do you answer that, people that are opposed to tax equality?
So I'll tell you what our folks are doing. We have a sister writing campaign and a network writing campaign. Letters to the both op-eds and letters to the editor. To make the fairness argument. There's not a member of Congress who doesn't read the local newspaper. So that's just an easy step that if folks feel they're equipped for that, that kind of advocacy works, as does, picking up a phone and calling your member of Congress, and saying, it's important to you and you identify yourself. That there are all kinds of tools. And again, network does that. Other groups do that beautifully. The goal is to be engaged in the fight.
And I would, add, underscoring something that I mentioned before, this agenda, these set of issues, present the applicants in a different light, in a framework that I think could work in states that aren't led by Democrats, or in Republican states, which I assume is sort of, let's not dance around the euphemism here, but which is that we're talking about people as workers. You become eligible for these credits because you work. You become, and we're talking about people as parents of US citizen children. We're talking about people who are fulfilling a civic duty, in some cases thought of as a sacred civic duty as parents. Throughout our social policies and throughout our tax codes, we privilege parents over and over and over again in many ways as a society, in something that up till now, even as polarized as we are, one point of unity in the society has been to value parents who are raising children as fulfilling a really important social mission. And what we're talking about here is supporting parents who are working poor. They work full-time, often more than full-time, and still end up poor. And they are raising, we said, this is 2 million children, of whom 1.6 million are US citizens, native born. The others are children who are going to live their lives here. They're here, they're not going away. They're our children, they're our responsibility as a society. So perhaps language on that order, of understanding who it is we're talking about and what's at stake, and how they present themselves to our society, why they're here and what they're doing, might open some minds.
Yeah.
It has. Go ahead, Hannah.
Yeah, I mean, just agreeing with everything that Roberto is saying. So much of this is framing. This issue has been framed by different states in so many different ways. And it is about, immigrant rights, but it also could be about enabling everyone who lives and works in the US to pay taxes, which has long been a goal of the government, and addressing child poverty. And the reality in addressing child poverty, as we said, is just that 1/5 of those children live with parents who file taxes with an ITIN. So I think a lot of it is about framing too, because this issue matters to everyone for different reasons.
Thank you. Very powerful responses. Let me add a couple of questions here, or ask a couple of questions. The first is from Julia Preston of the Marshall Project. Greetings to all. Roberto, could you speak more about your final point about these tax issues becoming a possible on-ramp to compliance? Is there a potential path to legalization here? And let me read a second one too, and it's more of a comment. And it says, to Roberto Soro and Hannah Finling, I just want to thank you both for your paper, research, and talk. I'm an international PhD student, so-called non-resident alien living in the US. I have been living in Indiana since 2018 and paid taxes regularly. And I do have a SSN. Despite this, however, I did not receive a single buck of the COVID-19 relief checks from the US government, regardless of the fact that my wife and 6-year-old son also live with me, whom I am barred to show in my tax return. Anyway, perhaps you can talk a little bit about if there is at all a light at the end of the tunnel. One more, hello. Trust is one important issue with immigrants. One of the issues that our low income tax clinic, Tennessee Taxpayer Project, has seen through 20 years, besides getting less benefits or tax credits, is the issue of renewal of ITINs. Okay, let me stop there. So first on the tax issues becoming an on-ramp and leading to kind of a potential path to legalization.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Julia. It plays a number of different ways. So one is in the current context of discussions of legalization, where if what is being proposed for the reconciliation bill comes through, we don't know the scope of it, but it won't cover the entirety of the population of people who are currently unauthorized. And so there will be an ongoing population to be addressed. And this is one way of addressing that population. Having an ITIN and filing taxes can be quite useful in any future legalization, for one thing, as a credential, as showing presence, as showing income, as showing that you've fulfilled obligations. You could imagine, as many previous legalization schemes have had, either in this reconciliation or more likely in something else, a kind of provisional status where people go through a period of time. This is not, we're not talking about DACA recipients or TPS recipients who are already registered and have socials, but everybody else. The scheme that's been used in the past has been to envision people going through a number of steps over a number of years as they approach full legalization and legal permanent residence. ITIN filing with access to tax credits could be one of those steps. It could be the way you start the process towards legalization. And finally, something that I would point to that a lesson I learned working with Don in examining the DACA registration process. If there's any kind of a registration for any kind of a benefit, even if there's a very limited legalization that comes out of the reconciliation bill, there will be a process of talking to a lot of people and asking them about their status. And one of the lessons we learned from DACA is it's a mistake to only concentrate on the benefit at hand and ignore everybody else. So if there's a limited legalization and there are a lot of people left over, ITIN education, moving people into that part of the process, particularly if there's something in return. The something in return would be access to tax credits, where there's then a bargain, there's a transaction. And this is where I really see the great potential here, where it's something that I call transactional recognition. You've got the individual and the government engaging in a transaction, saying, I am a worker and a parent who is poor. And the government is saying, yes, I recognize you as a worker and as a parent, and I'm going to help you alleviate that poverty. That recognition itself embodies the logic of legalization. It is the presentation, the registration, the identification of a person, and the government in return saying, I see you, I value you, I acknowledge you, and I'm going to give you something back. And you're doing that inside the heart of our social programs, inside the heart of our tax policy, and you're taking a major bureaucracy, the IRS, and making it an instrument of recognition. Making the IRS an instrument which says to people, I see you, I hear your name, and I see what you're doing in this country and the benefits it bring us. That to me, in a time when standard forms of legalization, the way we thought of them under comprehensive immigration reform, may be very hard to accomplish for some time, could be a step, could be something. It's going a different trajectory, but given the available alternatives, it might be worth considering.
Does anybody want to speak to the ITIN renewal problems or this issue of the PhD student, non-resident alien who was not able to get stimulus relief? I'm not really exactly sure what was happening in that case.
Yeah. ITIN renewal, I said, the administration could do a lot simply by executive action and funding as well, the IRS, to be fair. But you could change regulations to make it much easier to keep an ITIN once you have it. And eventually Congress should make it permanent, like the Social Security, so you don't have to be renewing it periodically.
And these aren't new ideas. This is what the taxpayer advocate has been recommending for years and years. There's documentation about it from every single year. So I guess you could consider that consider that, plus and a minus, that it's a documented issue. The solutions are already written out. It should be easy to fix. Just got to make it happen.
Yeah, and I think with the opportunity of Gene Sperling's group looking at implementation and his former, having the position he had in the previous administration, I would love to see what we can think of in terms of making sure that this actually moves forward, because this definitely seems like it should be in their strike zone. So it's a question of how do we make it happen.
There's a couple of very interesting questions. Can you talk about the estimates about how much money the US leaves on the table or loses by making it so challenging and not many incentives for the undocumented to get an ITIN and to file taxes? In other words, wouldn't the US gain money by expanding who is paying taxes? And then the second question, are there equal protection arguments for US citizen children to receive the same protections as other US citizen children?
Yes and yes. Yeah, no, there's no question. I mean, you increase the number of people paying taxes, you collect more taxes, and absolutely, there's an equal protection argument to be made. I'm not a constitutional lawyer, so with that caveat, to my untrained ear, it sounds to me like an equal protection argument.
You make the argument, which Emily Rio and others have made in your paper too, of really what you have in the United States, given immigration enforcement, tax policy, public benefit policy, is this kind of second-class citizen who's the child of an undocumented person and disadvantaged as a result of that. And I find that argument to be very powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a state like California, it's an enormous reality.
Mm-hmm. I don't think we have any additional Emma Dewey comments or questions from the group. I mean, we have questions about referrals and the like, but why don't we, are there final comments that people would like to make? We have just a couple of more minutes here.
I mean, one thing that I would underscore here is that for many of us who've either been participating or advocating or watching this issue for a lot of years, it's easy to get discouraged. Very easy to have been discouraged in the last several years in particular. On this issue, since last summer, really, there's been a lot of action, positive action, real momentum. This is, and Hannah and I started out on this on a project that was monitoring what states were doing in terms of their immigrant populations in response to the pandemic. I mean, way back and at the beginning of it all in the spring of 2020. And we kept seeing lots of stuff. And then the EITC expansion took hold with Colorado, California, and then one state after another. And it's real momentum. And there was real momentum then in Washington on the stimulus payments. And a lot of people got included, and sometimes included retroactively, all around, all because they were ITIN holders. So there's momentum here. There's particularly momentum out, it's always hard to see momentum in Washington, but there's real momentum out in the states to see this population as a population that's actionable, that is subject to policy in positive ways. And I think there's a wave to be ridden here. Hannah, would you agree?
Yeah, and just to underscore that, 30 states in the US have a state EITC credit, the others don't yet. And so almost a quarter of those states now include ITIN filers, and that's huge. I mean, that's since 2020. So I just wanted to emphasize that point about the current momentum and the progress being made right now.
Yeah, and I would just add, advocacy works. You know what I mean? There are, as Roberto was suggesting, there's going to be starts and stops. You know, Washington is always reactive. If you look at major piece of legislation, Washington, D.C. is usually the last to catch up. But I do think even on the Republican side with the cash benefits, like Mr. Rubio was in a good place, as was Mr. Romney. And there was bipartisan consensus to move forward. So again, I want to stop with hope. You know, there is hope here. And it's incumbent on us not to be indifferent, but to engage, because advocacy works.
Yeah, I mean, let me kind of end there. And I just wanted to thank all of you. Thanks to Roberto and Hannah for this really timely, powerful, hopeful, and impassioned presentation and paper. So such an important kind of intervention at this point, and a really, really well-written paper for people that in our audience that read. I know that there's still readers out there, so please do read it. And Laura too, thank you for your great work on this issue and so many other issues, and for your kind of hopeful report on what's possible at this moment. It does feel like it's a different day, and a far more kind of hopeful than it was a year ago or 2 years ago or whatever. So thanks to all of you, and we hope to continue working with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you so much.
Okay, have a good afternoon.